Okay, picture this in your mind for a second. You have the cross.
Right.
For billions of people, it's the ultimate symbol of love, of sacrifice, of suffering. But James Carroll, he wants you to imagine that same cross over centuries, slowly morphing.
Into a sword.
A literal weapon of state power. It is.
Right.
It's a haunting image, right? But it's the central metaphor of the book we're covering today.
And it really sets the stage for a conversation that is, well, it's going to make some people uncomfortable.
I have no doubt. But before we get into the really heavy stuff, I need to set the table properly. Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. More than just a summary, which we also include, this feature examines how the author shapes argument, builds influence, and owns or loses your trust, giving you the tools to read with sharper insight and greater discernment. Should you read this book? This should help. Also excellent for aspiring writers. If you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps guide our future content.
And just so we are fully transparent, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's NotebookLM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
Today, we are unpacking Constantine's Sword, The Church and the Jews, a history by James Carroll. And honestly, just calling it a history book feels like a huge undersell.
That's fair. It reads more like a courtroom drama mixed with a personal memoir.
And a theological manifesto.
Yes. Carroll isn't just reciting dates here. He is building a massive, sweeping argument. And our mission today is to really dissect how he does it. We'll cover the timeline, sure, but most of our time will be spent on how he blends history and his own story to persuade you.
To persuade you that the church bears this profound responsibility for the conditions that made the Holocaust possible.
Which is a massive accusation.
It is. I mean, linking the Vatican to the Nazis is about as controversial as it gets. So who is James Carroll to even make this claim? My first thought was, okay, is this just an outsider throwing stones?
A fair coffin. Because if he is, it's easy to just dismiss him.
Right.
And that is where Carroll is so smart. He knows he has an uphill battle. So he establishes his ethos, his credibility, right from the very beginning. He's not an outsider.
He's a former Catholic priest.
A National Book Award winner. A novelist. He grew up deep inside the system.
So it's not a hit piece. It's coming from inside the house.
Exactly. It's the classic insider-turned-critic trope, and it's incredibly effective. He uses his own biography to disarm you. He talks about his own crisis of faith.
He positions himself as a loyal critic.
He's basically saying, look, I love this tradition. I devoted my life to it, and that is precisely why I have to tell the truth about it.
It changes the whole tone. You feel like you're listening to a confession, not an attack. But let's talk about the structure, because he makes a very specific choice that I found. Well, jarring.
He doesn't start at the beginning.
No, not with Jesus, not with the Bible. He starts at the end. He starts at Auschwitz.
He does.
Why do that? Is he just going for pure shock value? Because starting with the Holocaust feels like a rhetorical punch to the gut?
It is a punch to the gut, but it serves a very specific purpose. It's an appeal to pathos to emotion.
How so?
Well, if you start with, say, theological debates in the first century, it all feels very abstract, very academic.
Right.
But by placing you at Auschwitz in the introduction, he grounds the entire book in real, concrete human suffering.
He tells that story about the cross at Auschwitz, the Carmelite convent.
Right. That was a huge controversy in the 80s and 90s. A group of nuns set up a convent just outside the camp and put up this massive cross.
To them, it's a symbol of prayer, of hope.
But to the Jewish community, it was deeply offensive. It looked like an attempt to Christianize the Holocaust, to claim the suffering of the victims under the very symbol that had been used to persecute them for centuries.
That story just perfectly highlights the disconnect. Two groups look at the exact same object
A cross.
and see two completely different things. One sees love, the other sees a sword.
And that becomes the launch pad for what he calls his archaeology of complicity. He starts digging backward from the gas chambers of World War II, peeling back the layers of history.
Through the Inquisition, the Crusades.
All the way back to the Gospels. He wants to show you that those gas chambers didn't just appear out of thin air.
Okay, so let's grab a shovel and dig with him. If the Holocaust is the surface level, what's underneath? How does he actually connect a first-century Roman execution to 20th century mass murder?
Well, he builds the argument on four main pillars. The first one is in the gospel narratives themselves. Carroll argues the early writers began shifting the blame for Jesus' death
Away from the Romans who actually did it.
and onto the Jewish people.
This is the Christ killer accusation.
It is.
Yeah.
And the theology behind it is called supersessionism, or replacement theology. It's this idea that the old covenant with the Jews was finished, and now Christians were the new Israel.
So God basically fired the Jews and hired the church.
That's a blunt way to put it, but yes. And it stripped Judaism of its validity in the eyes of Christians.
Okay, so you have the theological setup, but words are just words until someone has the power to enforce them.
Which brings us to pillar number 2, and the book's namesake, Constantine. This is the big turning point, 4th century. The emperor converts.
And suddenly the cross isn't a symbol of the persecuted anymore.
No, it's painted on the shields of the Roman legions.
That's the moment. The cross becomes the sword.
Literally. And once the church has state power behind it, that Christ killer narrative gets codified into law. Jews can't hold office, can't marry Christians. They become second-class citizens by imperial decree.
And from there we get into the Middle Ages, which sounds like an absolute horror show in his telling. He talks about the blood libel.
Yes.
I think people have heard that term, but can we explain what it actually was? It sounds like some kind of medieval conspiracy theory.
It was. It was the QAnon of the Middle Ages. This widespread, completely insane belief that Jews kidnapped Christian children to use their blood to make matzah for Passover.
Which makes zero sense.
None. Jewish law strictly forbids consuming blood, but facts didn't matter. Fear mattered.
In theology.
Fear in theology. Carroll details how this led to massacres. When the Black Death hit Europe, people needed a scapegoat. So who do they blame? The Jews, accused of poisoning the wells. Thousands were burned alive.
It's terrifying, but here's where I want to push back a bit. When you lay it out like that, Gospels, Constantine, Crusades, Holocaust, it sounds like a row of dominoes. It sounds inevitable, was it?
That's a crucial point. Carroll argues passionately that it was not inevitable. He talks about contingency, the idea that history is a series of choices, and he proves it by highlighting the roads not taken.
Okay, so give me an example. Who tried to stop this train?
The best example he uses is Pierre Abelard in the 12th century. This guy was basically the intellectual rock star of Paris.
Wait, before we get to his philosophy, he's the guy from the tragic love affair, right? With Heloise?
Yes, the very same.
Oh.
The famous Abelard and Heloise, it ended poorly for him. Let's just say her uncle was not pleased. But before all that, he was proposing a radical new way of thinking. His method was called sic et non. Yes and no. He believed doubt was the key to truth.
By doubting, we come to inquiry, and by inquiry, we perceive truth. I remember that quote.
That's the one. He argued that we should use reason to question contradictions in the church. And crucially, he rejected the demonization of Jews. He argued that the people who killed Jesus, if they did, thought they were doing God's will, so they couldn't be guilty of intentional deicide.
That's a huge shift. If you don't have deicide, the killing of God, you don't really have a foundation for anti-Semitism.
Exactly. But Abelard ran into a brick wall named Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was a mystic. He believed faith should be absolute, unquestioning. He saw Abelard's reason as just dangerous arrogance. He crushed him. Abelard was condemned as a heretic. His books were burned.
So Carroll's argument is if Abelard had won that debate,
if the church had embraced reason and doubt instead of blind obedience, the Inquisition might never have happened. The Crusades might have looked very different. The Holocaust might not have found such fertile soil.
that is a heavy what if. It makes you realize how much these ideas really, really matter.
It connects the abstract world of philosophy to the very concrete world of survival.
Ah.
And before we move on, let's take a second for Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, inspiring reflection and rational thought.
Okay, we're back. We've looked at the history. Now I want to look at the rhetoric. Carroll uses some pretty intense metaphors and data to rewire how we see the church. We talked about the sword, but there's a demographic argument he makes that it just blew my mind.
You mean the numbers game?
Yes, he compares the population of Christians and Jews from Constantine's time to today.
And it is a staggering contrast. He knows that back in the 4th century, there were roughly the same number of Christians and Jews in the world.
They're peer groups.
Basically, yes. Today, there are around 2 billion Christians and only about 15 million Jews.
2 billion to 15 million. I mean, that gap is just insane.
And Carroll frames that gap not as a success story, but as a violent triumph. He argues that disparity is the physical evidence of centuries of persecution and suppression. It's a very effective use of data.
It forces you to ask, where did everyone go?
Exactly.
But his boldest move, and this is where he really risks losing the traditional Catholic reader, is when he critiques the core theology of salvation itself. He goes after atonement theology.
This is the third rail of Christian theology. Atonement is that traditional idea that Jesus died to pay the price for humanity's sins, that his death was necessary to satisfy God's justice.
Which is pretty standard Sunday school stuff, so what's Carroll's problem with it?
He argues that if you focus entirely on Jesus' death as the thing that saves you, you inevitably need a villain. You need an executioner.
And historically, the church cast the Jews in that role.
That's his point. So he says, as long as we focus on the cross as this payment for sin, we're going to be, even subconsciously, anti-Semitic. He tries to reconstruct the faith to focus on Jesus' life and teachings instead.
On his resistance to power, his inclusion of the marginalized.
Right. Move the focus from the moment of death to the message of life.
That sounds good, but isn't he basically rewriting the entire religion? I can just hear the critics saying, you can't just delete the cross because it makes you uncomfortable.
And that is the major criticism. To be fair, traditional theologians argue he's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They say you can't strip atonement from Christianity without collapsing the whole structure.
They accuse him of ignoring nuance just to draw a straight line between Catholic belief and Nazi atrocities.
And that's the oversimplification critique. Historians point out that religious anti-Judaism is different from racial anti-Semitism. The Nazis were often anti-Christian too, so blaming the church for the SS it's complicated.
But Carroll isn't saying the Pope was flying the planes, is he?
No, not at all. He's arguing that the church tilled the soil, that after 1,500 years of teaching the Jews were cursed, rejected, and dangerous, when Hitler came along and said, let's get rid of them, the population of Europe didn't stand up and say no.
They had been conditioned to accept it.
That's the chilling part. It's not about active participation, but passive acceptance born from centuries of bad teaching.
So what's the solution? He isn't just venting, he has a plan. He calls for a Vatican III.
He does. He wants a new, massive church council to radically reform these doctrines. He wants the church to officially repent, not just for errors, but for the systemic theology that created the hatred.
But be honest, what are the odds of that actually happening? A Vatican III that rewrites core tenets of the faith sounds optimistic.
It's incredibly unlikely, at least in the way he envisions it, but I think Carroll knows that. He's writing for the future, for progressive Catholics and interfaith readers who want to salvage their faith without ignoring its dark shadow.
It's one of those books you can't really be neutral about. You either hate it or it changes your life.
That's the mark of a good polemic. And I think the final synthesis here is that he's using history as a moral mirror. He isn't saying you, the reader, are guilty. He's saying we are part of a stream of history. And if we don't understand the current, we're going to drown in it again.
That leads me to a final thought for everyone. We always hear that history is told by the victors. But this book flips that. It asks, what happens when a loyal insider decides to tell the story from the perspective of the victims? And here's the real question. Does acknowledging this dark history destroy faith, or is it the only way to save it? Can you love a tradition while admitting it once held a sword?
That is the question Carroll leaves us with, and it's one we all have to answer for ourselves.
Just a reminder to everyone listening, this has been a discussion of the arguments presented in Constantine's Sword and the accompanying analysis. We aren't endorsing any specific political or religious viewpoints. We're just exploring the challenging ideas in the book.
It's all about giving you the tools to think critically about the texts that shape our world.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary, subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.